My name is Robert, I am 27 years old, and I want to tell you about a bizarre event I experienced in my family when I was younger. At that time, I had never met my grandmother, my father's mother. My parents told me she had died shortly after my birth. Up to this point, nothing seemed unusual. Surely many other children like me had never met their grandmother, I thought. The strange thing was that throughout my childhood, my paternal grandmother was like a fleeting shadow in my family. Family photos rarely included her, and mentions of her were scarce and shrouded in mystery. My curiosity grew every time I heard her name, which happened very rarely, I must say. My parents' answers to my questions about her were always evasive, as if there was something to hide or protect. The situation wasn't clear to me, but I sensed that something was odd. As time went by, I learned to accept this absence as part of my family reality, although the curiosity about who my paternal grandmother really was always lingered. The few bits of information I managed to gather were fragmented and contradictory, which only fueled my desire to know more, even as a child. After many years, when I had grown up, I remember one day my parents told me they needed to talk to me and apologize. I didn't understand. What could they possibly need to apologize for? We sat around the table, and with some embarrassment, they began to talk about my grandmother, telling me that she hadn't died as they had made me believe, but was alive and well and living in a nursing home for the elderly. The news struck me like a bolt from the blue. I couldn't believe that all these years they had made me think she was dead. My parents proceeded to tell me the story, with a sincerity I had never seen before. They began to say that she was very jealous of my father, being an only child, which had made her very possessive towards him, and that when she met my mother, she started to go mad, fearing my mother might take her place. After receiving this news, I was deeply disappointed and angry. I felt betrayed and deceived for all those years of secrets and lies. Without saying a word, I got up from the table and went to my room, slamming the door behind me. For several hours, I stayed there, immersed in my thoughts, trying to process the anger and confusion I felt. Later, I decided to confront the situation and went back to them. We sat around the table again, and this time I was ready to listen to them thoroughly. There was a tension in the air, but also a sense of openness and sincerity. My parents apologized for not telling me the truth earlier and assured me they would try to explain what had happened many years before I was born. They told me that shortly after my father met my mother, one day they went to my grandmother's for lunch. Strangely, my grandmother accepted having my mother over for lunch despite her jealousy towards my father. My parents didn't think much of this behavior, believing that sooner or later my grandmother had accepted the situation. That day seemed to start well. My mother tried to make a good impression, while my father was happy that his mother was meeting his future wife. However, there was still some tension in the air. My grandmother, although seemingly available, was annoyed, and both my father and mother sensed it but pretended not to notice. During lunch, the situation became embarrassing. My grandmother started making sharp comments and sending barbed remarks towards my mother. Shortly after they started eating, my mother began to feel dizzy and rushed to the bathroom. Shortly after, she vomited, and my father didn't understand what was happening. My grandmother asked what was going on, seemingly concerned about the situation. The scene was confusing and chaotic, with my father trying to comfort my mother and my grandmother, apparently worried, asking if they should call a doctor. The situation grew stranger, and despite the confusion, my father began to suspect there was more behind my mother's sudden illness. At one point, my mother fainted, and my father immediately called an ambulance, which arrived within minutes. Once in the hospital, after a while, my mother recovered, and the doctors said that, in their opinion, it had been caused by poisoning. My father didn't understand. But then, thinking about how my grandmother was, he began to connect the dots. My father immediately returned to my grandmother, asking her if there was something she needed to tell him. After a heated argument, my grandmother confessed that she had put a small dose of rat poison in my mother's plate. My father couldn't believe it. He stood there staring at her without saying a word, incredulous at what he was hearing. Fortunately, my mother was discharged from the hospital the next day and was fine. From that moment on, all ties with my grandmother were severed. The news of what had happened shocked me deeply, It was hard to believe that my grandmother had tried to poison my mother, and the gravity of the situation left me speechless. That night, I couldn't sleep, tormented by thoughts. How could someone go so far? In the following days, the atmosphere at home was tense. My parents, visibly relieved to have finally shared their secret, tried to reconnect with me. I felt the need to ask them 1,000 questions, to better understand who my grandmother really was and why she had acted that way. One afternoon, I decided to ask my father to show me the old family photos, the ones in which my grandmother was present. I wanted to see her face. The photographs were hidden in a dusty box in the attic, away from everyday view. As I flipped through the images, my father told me anecdotes from his childhood, episodes that showed a loving but extremely possessive woman. I realized that her jealousy towards my father had always been there, but had intensified with the arrival of my mother. Each photo seemed to tell a different story, but all with the same thread of a distorted and suffocating love. In all the photos, even when my father was already an adult, my grandmother was there beside him, embracing him. I decided I needed to know more. I asked my parents if I could meet my grandmother. I wanted to look her in the eyes, hear her version of the facts. Despite their initial resistance, they eventually agreed, aware of my need for clarity. My grandmother lived in a nursing home not too far from us. My father, despite not having heard from her in years, called her saying that I wanted to meet her. She accepted immediately, probably also because she would see her son again after a long time. When we arrived, my heart was pounding. The facility was quiet, with a well-kept garden and elderly people strolling slowly. They led me to the common room where she was waiting for me. When I saw her, I was struck by how much she had changed. She was no longer the threatening woman from the stories I had been told, but a frail elderly lady with a look that reflected years of loneliness and regret. We sat facing each other, and a heavy silence fell between us. Finally, with a trembling voice, I began to speak. I told her who I was. I told her about my feelings, the confusion, and the anger I had felt. She listened in silence with tearful eyes. When it was her turn to speak, the words came out with difficulty. She told me about her love for my father, the terror she had felt at the thought of losing him with the arrival of my mother. She admitted she had made a mistake, acted in a crazy and dangerous way. But what struck me most was her request for forgiveness. She didn't seek excuses, just the possibility of being understood and perhaps accepted. At that moment, I realized that the situation was more complex than I had ever imagined. I couldn't change the past or erase the pain she had caused, but I could choose not to let that feeling of hatred and anger live within me anymore. At the end of our conversation, I stood up and hugged her. I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive her completely. That was something I would discover over time. But I knew that gesture was a beginning towards understanding and perhaps healing a family wound that had bled too long in the shadows of silence and mystery. I was really young when my family fell apart, too young to truly understand what was happening, but old enough to feel immense pain. My mother left us from one day to the next, and shortly after, my older sister moved to New York, leaving me alone with my younger brother and my father, who fell into a deep depression due to my mother's abandonment. Sometimes he stayed in his room all day. It was a really dark and painful period. I remember that my mother no longer wanted to hear about or see any of us. I didn't understand what was going through her mind and why she had abandoned us so suddenly. She had never been the loving mother I needed, but I never imagined she was capable of leaving us like that. Her departure left a void in my heart and forced me to confront a sense of abandonment and betrayal. It was a pain that stayed with me for years as I tried to understand the reason for her behavior and find the strength to move on without her. My sister also distanced herself from us. We only heard from her if we called, and even then, the conversations were brief and superficial. It was as if she had built a wall around herself, isolating from the rest of the family. A few years later, after my mother disappeared, we received a phone call from a relative with shocking news. My mother had passed away. In recent years, she had neglected herself, falling victim to alcoholism. The next day, we took a flight to Miami, where my mother had been living. a fact we were unaware of until then, which we only discovered because we were informed that the funeral would be held there. To my great surprise, my sister also came to the funeral. It had been quite some time since I had last seen her, and I must say she was unrecognizable. Looking at her, she seemed almost like a different person compared to the one I remembered. During my mother's funeral, we didn't have many opportunities to talk. She was constantly on the phone, almost as if she were detached from the present moment. Even though we were there to honor our mother's memory, it seemed her mind was elsewhere. I couldn't detect any sign of grief or emotional participation from her. Her phone conversations were particularly strange. Several times I heard her say she didn't have such a large sum of money, that she would get it as soon as possible, that there was no need to worry, and that she would resolve everything soon. Hearing her words, I began to think my sister was in a bad situation from which she couldn't escape. After the funeral ended, I approached her and told her I had overheard the phone call and wanted to understand what was going on. I looked into her eyes, trying to catch any sign of discomfort or worry. It was clear that something was wrong. Initially, my sister vehemently denied it, trying to minimize the situation and avoid facing reality. She was afraid to open up, fearing my judgment. However, with patience and determination, I managed to get her to talk. I looked at her with eyes full of concern and affection, encouraging her to confide in me. After a while, her emotional walls began to crumble, and she finally opened up to me. Her voice was thick with emotion and tears she was trying to hold back as she confessed the truth. She told me that a few years earlier, she had had financial problems and could no longer pay the rent for the house she was living in. To scrape something together, a friend of hers promised to help, and through her she met some men, but she ended up in a bad circle. She was trapped in a situation she couldn't free herself from. She told me she needed $57,000, otherwise they wouldn't leave her alone, and she didn't know what would happen. As I listened to her words, my heart broke for her. I couldn't imagine the fear and stress she had to endure every day. It was clear she needed help and support to get out of that situation before it was too late. I realized I had to do everything possible to help her get out of this dangerous vortex. I couldn't let my sister face it all alone. Even though she hadn't treated me well in recent years, I couldn't ignore the family bond that united us. We had to face this situation together. Suddenly, as we were leaving, a man furtively approached my sister and began threatening her, saying she had to pay. I don't know where that man came from, but it was evident he had followed her there. With a mix of anger and concern, I quickly approached and asked how he knew my sister was there. I told him to leave her alone and that I would provide the money he demanded. Of course, I didn't have the entire amount, but I said it just to make that man leave, who, before going, told my sister she had only 2 days to find that money. During those 2 days, we worked tirelessly to gather the requested amount. We called friends and relatives, sought every possible source of funding, and did our utmost to reach the sum. Finally, after 2 days of tension and uncertainty, we succeeded. With a mix of relief and gratitude, we handed the money over to the man. After this harrowing experience, my sister decided to move back to our city. It was an important step toward her rebirth and rebuilding her life, and I felt grateful to have supported her in that difficult moment. This experience, though challenging, helped reestablish a deep bond with my sister. Going through such a demanding ordeal together allowed us to rediscover the importance of mutual presence and solidarity in times of difficulty.